I never thought I would be standing in my driveway at 7 in the morning on a frozen January day in Bozeman, Montana, staring at an empty space where my propane tank used to be. The temperature was negative 12 degrees, my breath came out in white clouds, and my furnace had shut off 3 hours ago because there was no fuel left to burn. My name is William Ortega, and I had just become the latest victim of what I can only describe as the most brazenly criminal HOA president in American history. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to where this whole mess started. About 6 months before that frigid morning when I discovered my propane tank had vanished into thin air. I moved into Ponderosa Estates in late July, a planned community just outside Bozeman with about 40 homes, all of them tastefully designed to blend with the Montana landscape. The houses were beautiful, the views were spectacular, and the HOA fees seemed reasonable at $200 a month. I was a software developer who had just landed a remote position that let me work from anywhere, and I chose Montana specifically for the peace and quiet. I wanted mountains, space, and freedom from the chaos of city life. The HOA president was a man named Gerald Kramer, a stocky 52-year-old with a perpetual scowl and thinning gray hair that he combed over aggressively. He showed up at my door 3 days after I moved in, clipboard in hand, to welcome me to the neighborhood. That should have been my first warning sign. "William, is it?" he said, not waiting for me to confirm. "I am Gerald, HOA president. Just wanted to go over some rules with you." I invited him in, offered him coffee, and listened as he rattled off an exhausting list of regulations. The grass could not be taller than 3 inches. No vehicles could be parked on the street overnight. No decorations except during approved holiday periods. No alterations to the exterior of the home without written approval from the HOA board. The list went on for 20 minutes. "Sounds pretty standard," I said when he finally paused for breath. "We run a tight ship here," Gerald said, his eyes narrowing. "Some of the previous residents thought they could bend the rules. They learned otherwise." I did not like his tone, but I chalked it up to someone who took their volunteer position too seriously. I thanked him for stopping by and saw him out. As he walked down my driveway, he paused to examine my mailbox, running his fingers along the post as if checking for defects. Weird, but whatever. The first few months were quiet. I kept my lawn immaculate, followed every rule to the letter, and generally kept to myself. I met a few neighbors during my evening walks. Most of them seemed nice enough, though everyone spoke about Gerald in hushed, almost fearful tones. Linda Carmichael, who lived 3 houses down, warned me to stay on his good side. "He has made life hell for anyone who crosses him," she said, glancing around as if Gerald might materialize from the shadows. "Tom Richardson put up a bird feeder without approval last year. Gerald fined him every single day until he took it down. Cost Tom nearly $3,000. "Can he even do that?" I asked. "The HOA covenants give him a lot of power," Linda said, "and he knows how to use every bit of it." Winter arrived early that year, with snow starting in October. By November, we were buried under 2 feet of powder, and the temperatures began their steady decline into the brutal Montana winter. My house, like many in the area, ran on propane for heating. I had a 500-gallon tank installed on the side of my property when I first moved in, and I kept it well stocked. Propane was not cheap, especially during winter, but it was essential for survival. In early December, I received a notice from the HOA. My propane tank was in violation of community standards because it was visible from the street and was not properly screened. I needed to install landscaping around it within 30 days or face daily fines of $100. I was furious. The tank had been there for 5 months and suddenly it was a problem. I called Gerald immediately. "The rule has always been there," he said, his voice flat and unsympathetic. "You should have screened it when you installed it." "Nobody said anything about it until now," I argued. "And you have been by my house a dozen times. Why bring it up in December when everything is frozen?" "Rules are rules, William. You have 30 days. I hung up, seething. I called a landscaping company, but they told me they could not install anything until spring. The ground was frozen solid. I documented all of this in an email to Gerald, explaining that compliance was impossible until the weather improved. His response was curt. "Failure to comply will result in fines as outlined in the HOA covenants." I consulted with a lawyer who told me that Montana HOA laws did give associations significant enforcement power, but that fines had to be reasonable, and that I might have a case if the situation was genuinely impossible to fix. He suggested I attend the next HOA board meeting to plead my case in person. The meeting was held in mid-December at the community clubhouse. Besides Gerald, the board consisted of 2 other members, Patricia Hendricks, a timid woman in her 60s who barely made eye contact, and Marcus Webb, a younger guy who seemed perpetually distracted by his phone. It became clear within 5 minutes that Gerald ran the show, and the other 2 were just there to rubber stamp his decisions. I presented my case calmly and logically. I showed photos of the frozen ground, quotes from landscapers explaining why the work could not be done until spring, and a proposed timeline for compliance as soon as the weather permitted. Gerald listened with his arms crossed, his face impassive. When I finished, he did not even pause before speaking. Your timeline is noted, but the rules do not make exceptions for weather. The fines begin January 1st if the violation is not corrected. That is completely unreasonable, I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. I physically cannot comply. Then perhaps you should have thought of that before installing a non-compliant propane tank, Gerald said. I looked at Patricia and Marcus, hoping for some support, but Patricia stared at the table, and Marcus was scrolling through his phone. I left the meeting knowing I was screwed. January 1st arrived, and true to his word, Gerald began fining me $100 per day. I received daily notices slipped into my mailbox, each one documenting the continuing violation and the accumulating charges. By mid-January, I owed $1,500, and there was still no way to fix the problem. That brings us back to that frozen morning when I woke up to a cold house. I stumbled out of bed, confused about why the furnace was not running. I checked the thermostat and saw that it was calling for heat, but nothing was happening. My first thought was a mechanical failure, but when I went outside to check, I saw the truth. My propane tank was gone, not just empty. Gone. The whole thing had been removed, leaving only the concrete pad and disconnected copper lines. I stood there in my pajamas and winter coat, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. Who steals a propane tank? And how? The thing weighed several hundred pounds even when empty. This was not some random theft. This was deliberate, planned, and executed with equipment. I called the sheriff's office immediately. Deputy Miller arrived within an hour, a young woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She took photos, examined the scene, and asked me questions about who might have access to my property. "Any disputes with neighbors?" she asked. "Just the HOA president," I said, and I filled her in on the whole saga with Gerald. Her expression darkened. "Gerald Kramer? You know him?" "We have had complaints about him before," she said carefully. "Nothing we could ever make stick. But yeah, he is on our radar." She told me she would file a report and investigate, but she was honest about the challenges. Without witnesses or evidence, it would be difficult to prove who took the tank. "Do you have any security cameras?" she asked. I felt like an idiot. "No, I never thought I would need them here." After Deputy Miller left, I spent the morning scrambling to find temporary heating solutions. I bought 3 space heaters from the hardware store and prayed my electrical system could handle the load. I also called around to propane companies about getting a new tank installed, but everyone was backed up with winter emergencies. The earliest anyone could come out was 3 weeks. That afternoon, my neighbor Linda stopped by with a thermos of hot soup. She looked worried. "I heard about your tank," she said. "This is getting out of hand." "You think Gerald did this?" I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "His propane tank is on the same side of his house as yours. Same setup. I saw him out there yesterday morning with his truck. He had some kind of trailer attached." My heart started pounding. Why would he steal my tank? "His tank is ancient," Linda said. "I heard him complaining about it last month, saying he needed to replace it but could not afford a new one right now. His words, not mine." I could not believe what I was hearing. He stole my 500-gallon propane tank because he did not want to buy his own? "I'm just telling you what I know," Linda said. "But William, be careful. Gerald is not just petty, he is vindictive." After Linda left, I made a decision. I drove to the nearest electronics store and bought a complete security camera system, the kind with night vision, motion detection, and cloud storage. I spent the rest of the day installing cameras covering every angle of my property, including one aimed directly at the area where my propane tank used to be. Then I did something that might have been slightly crazy, but I was beyond caring. I rented a temporary propane tank from a local company, one of those smaller 200-gallon units that could be delivered quickly. They brought it out the next day and set it up exactly where my stolen tank had been. I made sure my cameras captured everything, but I did not stop there. I also bought a GPS tracker, the kind used for tracking vehicles or valuable equipment. I attached it discreetly to the rental tank in a location where it would not be obvious. If someone moved that tank, I would know exactly where it went. 2 days later, at 3 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from my security system. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the camera feed, my heart racing. There, illuminated by my infrared cameras, was Gerald Kramer. He was wearing dark clothing and a winter hat, but there was no mistaking his build and the way he moved. He had backed his truck and trailer into my driveway, and he was working on disconnecting my rental propane tank. I could not believe he was doing this again. The audacity was breathtaking. I grabbed my phone and started screen recording the live feed while simultaneously calling the sheriff's office. 911, what is your emergency? Someone is stealing my propane tank right now, I said, keeping my voice low even though I was inside my house. I can see him on my security cameras. What is your address? I gave her the information and she told me deputies were on the way. I stayed on the line, watching as Gerald finished disconnecting the tank. He used some kind of small crane or winch system mounted on his trailer to lift the tank. The whole operation took him about 15 minutes. He was clearly experienced with this kind of theft. Just as he was securing the tank on his trailer, I saw the flash of red and blue lights approaching. Gerald saw them too. He froze for a moment, then tried to get into his truck, but 2 sheriff's vehicles pulled up, blocking him in. I ran outside, no longer caring about staying hidden. Deputy Miller was one of the responding officers, along with an older deputy named Rawlings. They had Gerald in handcuffs within seconds. "That's my tank," Gerald was saying, his voice high and panicked. "There's been a mistake." "That's my rental tank," I said, approaching the scene, "and I have video of him stealing it. Plus, I have video of him stealing my original tank 3 days ago." Gerald's face went pale. "You do not have any such thing." "Actually, I do." I pulled up my phone and showed Deputy Miller the footage. The cameras had captured everything in crystal clear detail, including Gerald's face. "I am going to need you to come down to the station," Deputy Rawlings said to Gerald, reading him his rights. "This is harassment," Gerald sputtered. "I am the HOA president. I was just enforcing community standards." "By stealing his property?" Deputy Miller said, her tone incredulous. "That is a new one." They loaded Gerald into one of the patrol cars while I gave my statement. Deputy Miller told me they would need all my camera footage for evidence, and I eagerly provided it. They also took photos of the tank on Gerald's trailer and documented everything. "We will need to search his property," Deputy Rawlings said. "If your original tank is there, that is going to make this case open and shut." "I put a GPS tracker on this rental tank," I admitted. "Is that going to be a problem?" Deputy Miller actually smiled. "For you? No. For him? Yeah, probably." They left with Gerald, and I reconnected my rental tank. I was too wired to sleep, so I sat in my living room, watching the sun come up and processing everything that had just happened. Around 9 in the morning, Deputy Miller called me. "We got a warrant and searched Kramer's property. Your original propane tank is there, hooked directly into his heating system. He even tried to paint over your serial number, but we can still read it. We will get it back to you as soon as we are done with processing." "What is he being charged with?" I asked. "Grand theft, criminal mischief, and we are looking at possible fraud charges related to the HOA fines. Turns out he has been running a few questionable schemes with HOA money. This investigation is opening up a whole can of worms." Over the next few days, the story exploded through our community. It turned out I was not Gerald's only victim. Once people heard he had been arrested, others started coming forward with their own stories of suspicious activity. Money had gone missing from the HOA accounts. Fines had been assessed that violated proper procedure. Gerald had even charged the HOA for services that were never performed, pocketing the difference. The most disturbing discovery was that Gerald had stolen or borrowed items from at least 3 other properties over the past year. A generator from one house, expensive patio furniture from another. Each time he had manufactured some HOA violation to justify his actions, or he had simply waited until the homeowner was out of town. The local newspaper picked up the story, and suddenly I was getting calls from reporters. The headline read, HOA, President arrested for propane tank theft, broader investigation underway. It was surreal seeing my situation in print. The district attorney assigned to the case was a sharp woman named Elizabeth Ellis, who specialized in property crimes and fraud. She contacted me to go over my testimony and evidence. We met at her office in downtown Bozeman, a modest building that smelled like old coffee and paper. "Your camera footage is excellent," Elizabeth said, reviewing the files on her laptop. "This is one of the most clear-cut theft cases I've seen. The fact that he came back a second time, knowing you were the one reporting the first theft, shows a level of arrogance that is going to help us in court." "What kind of sentence is he looking at?" I asked. "Grand theft in Montana can carry up to 10 years, though he will likely get less if he pleads out. But with the additional fraud charges and the multiple victims, I am pushing for actual prison time, not just probation." "Good," I said. I was not typically a vindictive person, but what Gerald had done went beyond a simple crime. He had abused a position of trust, targeted people in his own community, and endangered my safety during one of the coldest months of the year. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for early February. Gerald's lawyer tried to get the charges reduced, arguing that this was a civil dispute that had escalated, but the judge was not having it. With my video evidence and the GPS data showing the tank's movement to Gerald's property, there was no ambiguity about what had happened. Gerald pleaded not guilty, which meant we were going to trial. Elizabeth told me this was posturing and that he would likely change his plea once he realized how strong the evidence was. In the meantime, the HOA held an emergency meeting to remove Gerald from his position and elect new leadership. I attended, along with most of the neighborhood. The atmosphere was tense but also somewhat relieved, as if everyone had been waiting for Gerald's reign to end. Patricia Hendricks, the timid board member, actually found her voice. She stood up and detailed years of Gerald's bullying and manipulation, including times he had threatened her when she questioned his decisions. Marcus Webb admitted he had only joined the board because Gerald promised to waive his HOA fees, an arrangement that was completely against the rules. The vote to remove Gerald was unanimous. A new president was elected, a retired schoolteacher named Henry Cross, who promised transparency and common sense. One of his first acts was to void all of Gerald's pending fines, including the $1,500 he had charged me for the propane tank screening violation. "We are going to review every decision Gerald made over the past 3 years," Henry announced. "If anyone has been unfairly fined or had their complaints ignored, please come forward. We are going to make this right." The mood in the room shifted from tense to almost celebratory. People started sharing stories, some angry, some darkly funny. It turned out Gerald had been terrorizing the neighborhood for years, and everyone was just too intimidated or exhausted to fight back. As winter dragged on, I focused on repairing the damage Gerald had caused. The county returned my original propane tank in mid-February, fully inspected and certified. They had removed Gerald's amateur paint job and restored my serial number markings. Getting it reinstalled was expensive, but my insurance covered most of the cost after I filed a claim for theft and vandalism. The trial was scheduled for late March. As the date approached, Elizabeth kept me updated on the prosecution strategy. They had built an overwhelming case, not just for my stolen tank, but for the broader pattern of theft and fraud. 4 other homeowners were also pressing charges for various items Gerald had taken. The week before trial, Gerald's lawyer reached out to Elizabeth with a plea deal. Gerald would plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence recommendation. Elizabeth consulted with all the victims, including me, before agreeing to the terms. "Leses prado, metki chao." He is going to plead to felony theft, criminal mischief, and fraud, she explained. "We are recommending 5 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 3. He will also have to pay full restitution to all victims and surrender his rights to hold any HOA position in Montana." Will he actually serve time? I asked. That was my main concern. With his record and the severity of the crimes, yes. The judge has discretion, but given the circumstances, I am confident he will impose the prison sentence. The plea hearing was anticlimactic compared to what I had expected from a trial. Gerald stood before Judge Morrison, a stern man in his 60s who clearly had no patience for criminals who preyed on their neighbors. Gerald mumbled his guilty pleas, his earlier arrogance completely deflated. When it came time for victim impact statements, I spoke. I kept it brief but honest, describing the fear and anger I felt when I discovered my heating source had been stolen in the middle of winter. I talked about the financial burden, the violation of trust, and the relief I felt knowing Gerald would face consequences. 3 other victims also spoke, each adding their own stories to the record. By the end, even Gerald's lawyer looked uncomfortable. Judge Morrison did not hesitate when delivering the sentence. Mr. Kramer, you held a position of trust within your community, and you abused it systematically and maliciously. Your actions endangered lives and caused significant financial harm. I am sentencing you to 6 years in the Montana State Prison with eligibility for parole after 4 years. You will also pay full restitution to all victims in the amount of $47,000, and you are permanently barred from serving in any HOA or community organization in this state. 6 years, more than the plea deal recommended. Then I felt a wave of satisfaction wash over me. Gerald was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He did not look at any of us as he passed. In the weeks following the sentencing, life in Ponderosa Estates began to normalize. Henry Cross turned out to be an excellent HOA president, focusing on actual community improvement rather than petty rule enforcement. He organized a neighborhood barbecue in April when the weather finally warmed up, and for the first time since moving in, I actually felt like part of a community. Linda Carmichael and I became good friends. She told me she'd been planning to move because of Gerald, but had decided to stay now that he was gone. Several other families expressed similar sentiments. Gerald had been slowly killing the neighborhood spirit, and his removal felt like a collective exhale. The restitution process took months, but eventually I received a check for my losses. The cost of replacing my propane tank, the emergency heating expenses, the security camera system, and compensation for the stress and time involved. It came out to about $8,000. Gerald's assets were being liquidated to pay all his victims. I also learned through the grapevine that Gerald's wife had filed for divorce shortly after his sentencing. She claimed she had no knowledge of his criminal activities, and I actually believed her. She moved out of Ponderosa Estates within a month, and their house went up for sale. By summer, the whole ordeal felt like a strange nightmare. My propane tank was properly secured and screened with landscaping, something I did voluntarily because it actually did look better. My security cameras remained up, though I was more relaxed about checking them. The footage of Gerald's theft had racked up millions of views after someone uploaded it to YouTube with my permission, and I still got the occasional message from people sharing their own HOA horror stories. One evening in late June, I was sitting on my back deck, watching the sunset over the mountains and sipping a beer, when my phone rang. It was Elizabeth Ellis, the district attorney. "William, I wanted to give you an update," she said. "The Montana Attorney General's office has launched a broader investigation into HOA fraud across the state. Your case became the catalyst. They are looking at criminal conduct in community associations statewide." "Really?" I was stunned. "Your evidence and testimony were so compelling that it got people's attention at the state level. There are apparently dozens of situations similar to yours where HOA leaders have been abusing their power or outright stealing from residents. You helped shine a light on a real problem." "I'm glad something good came from all this," I said. "Me too. Thank you for being willing to stand up and fight. A lot of people would have just moved away or suffered in silence." After we hung up, I sat there thinking about everything that had happened. I never imagined that installing security cameras would lead to exposing a criminal, much less sparking a statewide investigation. But I was grateful for the outcome. Justice had been served, and my community was better for it. The following year passed quietly. Gerald remained in prison, denied parole at his first hearing. The judge noted his lack of remorse and the calculated nature of his crimes. He would be eligible again in another year, but I doubted he would get out early. Henry Cross continued to do an excellent job as HOA president. Under his leadership, Ponderosa Estates thrived. Property values increased. New families moved in. The neighborhood became known for its friendliness and common-sense approach to community management, a stark contrast to the Gerald Kramer era. I eventually started dating someone I met through a local hiking group, a veterinarian named Emma Erickson, who had lived in Bozeman her whole life. When I told her the propane tank story on our third date, she laughed so hard she nearly spit out her wine. "Only in Montana," she said. "That is the most Montana crime I have ever heard." "It made national news," I pointed out, "because it is absurd. Who steals a propane tank?" She shook her head, still grinning. "I'm glad you nailed him, though. Guys like that give HO as a bad name." Emma and I got serious over the following months. She moved into my house in Ponderosa Estates the next spring, bringing her 2 dogs and a cat. The neighborhood welcomed her warmly, and she fit right in. Life became beautifully ordinary. I worked my remote job, Emma ran her veterinary practice, and we spent our weekends exploring Montana's incredible wilderness. The propane tank incident became a funny story I told at parties, always leading to people sharing their own HOA nightmares. But mine had a satisfying ending, which seemed to be rare in that particular genre of suburban warfare. 2 years after Gerald's sentencing, I got a call from Deputy Miller. She had been promoted to detective and was calling to let me know that Gerald was being released on parole. "I wanted to give you a heads up," she said. "He served just over 3 years. As a condition of his parole, he's not allowed within 500 feet of Ponderosa Estates or any of his victims." "Where's he going?" I asked. "He has a sister in Billings. He will be living there and working at a warehouse. Trust me, we will be keeping an eye on him. If he violates his parole conditions in any way, he goes right back to prison." "Thanks for letting me know," I said. After we hung up, Emma asked if I was worried about Gerald getting out. "Not really," I said honestly. "He knows he is being watched, and he knows we have all the evidence we need to put him back in prison if he tries anything. I think he is done with Ponderosa Estates." I was right. Gerald never came back to our neighborhood. According to updates from Elizabeth Ellis, he worked his warehouse job, attended his parole meetings, and kept his head down. Whether he had actually learned his lesson or was just scared of going back to prison, I did not know. But the result was the same. He stayed away. Ponderosa Estates continued to flourish. Henry Cross served as HOA president for 3 years before passing the torch to Marcus Webb, who had transformed from Gerald's puppet into a genuinely engaged community leader. Marcus ran on a platform of minimal interference and maximum transparency, and he won the election easily. One of Marcus's first initiatives was creating an HOA newsletter that detailed all finances and decisions in plain language. He also established a formal appeals process for any fines or violations, ensuring that no single person could wield the kind of unchecked power Gerald had abused. The neighborhood also adopted a community watch program. After my experience, several other residents installed security cameras. We created a shared system where anyone could report suspicious activity, and we had a direct line to the sheriff's office. Property crime in our area dropped to nearly 0. 5 years after the propane tank incident, Emma and I got married in a small ceremony at a lodge overlooking the mountains. Most of Ponderosa Estates attended, including Henry Cross, who gave a touching speech about how communities are built on trust and maintained by people willing to stand up for what is right. Linda Carmichael caught the bouquet, which was hilarious because she was 68 years old. She laughed and said she was too old for romance, but 6 months later, she started dating a widower from the next neighborhood over. Love really does work in mysterious ways. I never saw Gerald Kramer again after that day in court. According to public records, he completed his parole and left Montana entirely, moving to Arizona to live with his son. The last I heard, he was working as a night janitor at a shopping mall. It was a far cry from his days as the petty tyrant of Ponderosa Estates, and I felt no sympathy for his reduced circumstances. Sometimes, when I am filling up my propane tank or checking my security cameras, I think about how one act of outrageous theft changed so many lives. It exposed a criminal, reformed a community, sparked a statewide investigation, and taught me the value of documentation and persistence. It also reminded me that most bullies are cowards at heart, and when confronted with real consequences, they crumble. Emma and I eventually started a family. Our daughter, Sophie, was born in the spring, and she became the darling of Ponderosa Estates. Neighbors stopped by with gifts and casseroles, and Linda Carmichael became her unofficial grandmother, spoiling her shamelessly. One evening, when Sophie was about 2 years old, she toddled over to the window and pointed at the propane tank in our side yard. "What's that, Daddy?" she asked. Emma and I exchanged a look, and we both started laughing. "That is a propane tank, sweetie," I said, "and Daddy has a very long story about it that we will tell you when you are older." "Much older," Emma added, still giggling. Life in Ponderosa Estates had become everything I hoped for when I first moved to Montana. Peaceful, beautiful, and filled with good people. The nightmare of Gerald Kramer's reign was firmly in the past, replaced by a functional community that looked out for one another. The security camera system I installed during those dark winter days remained active, though now it mostly captured boring footage of deer wandering through my yard or the occasional delivery driver. But I kept it running anyway, a reminder that vigilance and preparation can make all the difference when you are facing down someone who thinks they are above the law. I also kept in touch with Elizabeth Ellis, who continued her work prosecuting fraud and property crimes. She told me that the statewide HOA investigation had led to multiple arrests and significant reforms in how community associations were regulated in Montana. New laws required financial audits, limited fine amounts, and established clear procedures for removing board members who abused their authority. "Your case really did change things," she told me during a phone call. "I know it probably does not feel like it affected much beyond your neighborhood, but the ripple effects have been substantial." That meant a lot to me. Nobody wants to become the victim of a crime, but if my experience helped prevent others from suffering similar situations, then something positive had come from the chaos. Years continued to pass. Sophie grew into a smart, curious child who loved hiking and animals just like her mother. We added another daughter, Lily, and our house became filled with the wonderful chaos of family life. The propane tank story became a legendary tale in our household, told and retold whenever we had guests. Gerald Kramer faded into obscurity, becoming nothing more than a cautionary tale about what happens when small-minded people get a taste of power and abuse it. His name was occasionally mentioned in articles about HOA reform or when someone shared the viral video of his arrest, but mostly he was forgotten, which seemed like the appropriate fate for someone who had caused so much unnecessary misery. Ponderosa Estates remained a wonderful place to live. Property values climbed steadily. New amenities were added, including a playground and community garden. The HOA, under responsible leadership, became a genuine asset rather than a source of stress and fear. Annual meetings were well attended and productive, focusing on actual improvements rather than petty enforcement actions. On the 10th anniversary of my move to Montana, Emma and I hosted a neighborhood barbecue at our house. Nearly everyone from Ponderosa Estates attended, along with some folks from surrounding communities. As I stood at the grill, flipping burgers and watching my daughters play with other kids on the lawn, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Henry Cross approached with a beer in hand. He was older now, his hair white and his movements slower, but his eyes still sparkled with warmth and intelligence. "Hell of a decade, William," he said, clinking his bottle against mine. "You can say that again," I replied. "You know, I've been thinking," Henry said. "When you first moved here, we were all so beaten down by Gerald that nobody had the courage to fight back. You did what the rest of us should have done years ago. You stood up to him." "I just documented what happened," I said. "The cameras did most of the work." "No," Henry said firmly. "You took action when it mattered. A lot of people would have just moved away or given up. You fought, and you won. And more importantly, you made this place better for everyone." I did not know what to say to that, so I just nodded and focused on the grill. The party went late into the evening. Kids ran around catching fireflies. Adults sat in lawn chairs, talking and laughing. Music played from someone's portable speaker. It was exactly the kind of scene I had imagined when I first moved to Montana. the dream of community and connection that Gerald had nearly destroyed. As the night wound down and guests started heading home, Emma came over and wrapped her arms around me from behind. "Good party," she said. "Really good," I agreed. "Think we will still be here in another 10 years?" she asked. "Absolutely," I said without hesitation. "This is home." And it was. Despite the rocky start, despite the theft and the stress and the legal battles, Ponderosa Estates had become exactly where I was meant to be. The propane tank incident, as absurd and criminal as it was, had ultimately strengthened our community. It had forced people to confront a toxic situation and had empowered them to create something better. Sometimes the worst moments in life lead to the best outcomes. Gerald Kramer tried to steal my propane tank, but in the end, he gave me something far more valuable: a clear understanding of what community really means and the knowledge that standing up for yourself, armed with evidence and determination, can actually make a difference. My security cameras are still running. My propane tank is still there, properly screened and maintained, and Gerald Kramer is somewhere far away, living with the consequences of his actions. Justice was served, not just for me but for everyone he victimized. That is not always how these stories end, but I am grateful that this one did. The night air was cool as Emma and I cleaned up after the party. Sophie and Lily were already asleep inside, exhausted from playing. I paused to look at my house, my property, my piece of Montana paradise that I had fought to keep. "What are you thinking about?" Emma asked. "Just appreciating what we have," I said. "It is easy to take it for granted, but we are lucky." "We really are," she agreed. We finished cleaning up and headed inside. As I locked the door and set the security system, I glanced at my phone to check the camera feeds. Everything was quiet and peaceful, just the way it should be. That propane tank, the one that Gerald Kramer stole on that frozen January morning, was still working perfectly. It kept my family warm through harsh Montana winters. It powered my hot water and my stove. It was a crucial piece of equipment, but it had also become a symbol of something larger: the importance of documentation, the value of persistence, and the reality that bullies and thieves eventually face justice if their victims refuse to be silent. I thought about all the people who had reached out to me over the years after seeing the security camera footage or reading articles about the case. So many of them shared similar stories of HOA abuse, property theft, and small-scale tyranny in their own communities. Most had not fought back, either because they did not have evidence or because they were too intimidated by the system. My message to all of them was simple: document everything, know your rights, and do not be afraid to stand up for yourself. The law works when you give it the evidence it needs. Security cameras are cheap, lawyers are available. The system is not perfect, but it can deliver justice if you are willing to push for it. Gerald Kramer probably thought he could get away with stealing my propane tank because he had gotten away with so much else for so many years. He believed his position as HOA president made him untouchable, that his neighbors were too intimidated to challenge him. He was wrong on all counts, and that miscalculation cost him his freedom, his reputation, and his future. I never claimed to be a hero or a crusader. I was just a guy who wanted to live peacefully in Montana, heat his house in the winter, and be left alone. But when someone threatened that basic security, I fought back with every legal tool available. The fact that my case sparked broader reforms was a bonus, but my primary goal was always simple: justice for what was done to me, and I got it, completely and satisfyingly. And Gerald Kramer went to prison. I got my property back. The community was reformed. The state changed its laws. Everything worked out exactly the way it should have, which is rare enough that I will always be grateful for how it played out. As I drifted off to sleep that night, with Emma beside me and my daughters safe in their rooms, I thought about that frozen January morning one last time. The shock of seeing the empty space where my propane tank should have been, the anger at the violation, the determination to make things right, all of it had led to this moment, this life, this home. Tomorrow I would wake up and go about my normal routine. I would work on my computer, maybe take the dogs for a walk, help Emma with dinner. Normal, peaceful, boring life. And after everything that had happened with Gerald Kramer, boring had never felt so good. The propane tank sat outside in the darkness, full and functional, connected to my house through a maze of copper pipes and valves. It would keep running for years to come, heating my home and supporting my family. And every time I saw it, I would remember the lesson it taught me, that standing up to bullies and thieves is not just possible but necessary, that evidence and persistence can overcome even entrenched corruption, and that justice, while sometimes slow, is real. Gerald Kramer stole my propane tank in the middle of winter, hooked it up to his own house, and thought he had gotten away with it. But my cameras caught him. The law prosecuted him. And in the end, justice prevailed. That is not just the end of a story. That is how things should work. And knowing that I played a part in making sure they did work brings me satisfaction every single day. The Montana wind howled outside, but inside my house it was warm and safe. My family was protected, my property was secure, and somewhere far away, the man who tried to steal from me was living with the consequences of his actions. The system worked because I made it work, because I refused to be a victim, because I documented everything and fought back. That is my story. That is how an HOA president stole my propane tank in the dead of winter, hooked it to his house, and how my cameras caught him. It is a story about crime and punishment, about community and justice, about standing up for yourself when the stakes are high and the odds seem long. And most importantly, it is a story with a happy ending, which in this world of HOA horror stories makes it special indeed. I hope anyone reading this who faces similar situations will take heart. You are not powerless. You can fight back. Document everything, know your rights, and do not be afraid to pursue justice. It might take time and effort, but it is worth it. Your home is your castle, and nobody has the right to steal from you, no matter what position they hold or what power they think they have. Gerald Kramer learned that lesson the hard way. And Ponderosa Estates became a better place because one homeowner refused to be a victim and had the cameras to prove what really happened. That is my story, and I am sticking to it.